15. The trio soon discovered that Sasquatch was a very alien place to them in comparison to what they were used to. Beyond the soil, beyond the mountains, even beyond the strangely green trees, it was the creatures they found the most jarring. Their first discovery was strange bugs as tall as their knees covered in sharp spikes. Their shells were oddly fragile, but the purpose for that quickly became clear. Once, when Chesney cleanly sliced through one which had approached, the two halves quickly curled around themselves to become two completely independent halves. Though Medea wished they were smart enough to deduce that further physical attacks would produce similar results, that was not the case. The first attack by a single one of the creatures became a swarm of fist-sized balls of spikes, hissing and zapping them with electric shocks. Eventually their mass became small enough to crush outright. Using elemental spells eventually proved to be far more effective because they would not split from attacks of that nature. But they were hardy creatures, and took a truly tiresome amount of damage to be killed. The next creatures they discovered were something between a pack rat and a lizard. They were fast, territorial, came in large packs, and to their absolute joy, discovered they were capable of using rudimentary spells. They were able to put up magic-reflecting barriers. Medea surmised that the bug things and lizard things might have been in an evolutionary arms race, but regardless, on the occasions when they were set upon by both, having to switch between attack methods was very tricky. Her birds were almost pleasant in comparison to the local avian variety. These vicious creatures were somehow all twin-headed, and could whip feathers in wide arcs to slice at all of them. The thought of what else may be out there they hadn't yet encountered was chilling. Often, there were great sounds of clashes away in the distance that they could only hear, and drum up nightmare creatures in their imaginations to fill the void of knowledge. Eventually the team, battered, bruised, and bloody as they were, felt like they were getting used to facing all these new threats. But as sure as the sun would set that day, their bottles became emptier, their bellies more hungry, and Medea was more and more drained from using the crown. While it was true that the crown had seemingly limitless powers when it came to healing, it was still an emotional toll, and a mental one. It soon became very clear that they were taking far too many wounds from the teeming wilderness jaunt. Despite the dangers of overuse of drugs, they had little choice as the hours of walking and battle drained them. The map they showed them that there was a settlement to the east. They were halfway there, and they had 3 pills left that they were holding on to for an emergency. The journey had started out very positive and upbeat, but now their conversations had died, nerves were frayed, and they were all bone-weary. Even the sun gone behind a thick overcast sky, turning the landscape dark, gray, and purple. Medea could see the sword in Chesney's hand begin to sag in his grip. He refused to sheath it anymore, since it was always precious seconds wasted to take it out each time they were attacked. And as for Wild, the older girl had not come especially well armored for the journey and had taken some of the worst blows.
Okay, everyone, let's just stop. We need a break, I think,
she called out, stopping by a set of boulders that would make for passing cover. Chesney looked like he wanted to say something, but then simply nodded, and sat down against a boulder. Wild groaned in relief. To Medea's surprise and annoyance, Wild sat next to Chesney. There wasn't any more room against that boulder to sit and still be hidden, and so she reluctantly sat on a boulder across from them. Wild, even sitting, was half a head taller than Chesney. Unbidden, Medea imagined them both sleeping, heads turned to lean against each other. A knot of something dropped in her stomach like a stone. She felt hot and angry, and maybe a little afraid, but also none of those things. It was a swirl of feelings she had never really felt before. Just that the indescribable thoughts made her feel petty and small. Too tired to eat, they passed around a skein of water, taking but a mouthful each.
You know,
Wild began, though lacking in her usual energy and enthusiasm.
I'm not really getting how you two fit into all this. What do you mean?
Chesney asked.
Well, like, Medea I kinda get. She arrived on the night of the comet 13 years back. She came with the crown. Zagos tried to have her kidnapped. Wait, Hold on, before I continue. So how did you arrive that night exactly?
The stone in her stomach painted the innocuous question into something vaguely accusatory.
Well, I'm not some freak, if that's what you're asking,
she replied, acidly. Chesney raised an eyebrow at her.
Medea, nobody said that. And actually, I'm quite curious about that too. I kept meaning to ask myself, but I guess I got pretty distracted.
She felt both stupid and justified in her response, but she knew she was being foolish. She tried to stamp out that part of her that was feeling so odd, and pretend everything was normal.
Right. Why, sorry, Wild. Anyway, I am not completely sure. All I know is that one night, a bright comet appeared in the sky to the north, making the sky much brighter. That night, the waves were dangerous and everyone stayed away from the sea. The next morning, a great many things had washed up on shore, and I was there as a baby, crying on the beach, held in a strange small boat. There was no note or anything, just me, and the crown, and I only knew about the crown very recently. What do you think that means?
Medea shrugged.
I don't know. I honestly didn't think about it much until all this happened. I like to try to think what my parents were like. Were they caught out in the ocean when the comet passed, and that stirred up something in the sea and destroyed their ship? Or maybe it's something else entirely.
Was all Wild said for a moment.
Well, okay. Thanks for explaining that. But, putting all that aside, what I don't get is Chesney, then. As far as I can tell, there's nothing special about him.
He glowered.
Hey. No. Not like that. I just mean, you're just some kid from a fishing village. All that changed for you is that you put your hand on a panel in the tower, and then bam! Nobody knew about you. No kidnapping attempts. And yeah, I get that the timing is a bit suspicious, but couldn't it have been anyone?
Chesney stared at his hand with a crafted neutral expression that Medea knew meant he was probably blaming himself and trying to hide it.
Well, according to Daphne, apparently not. But who knows? Fate, destiny, your dumb luck? It doesn't really matter to me.
Wild was halfway through a remark to the contrary, when Medea felt something, a light tremble. When she first felt it, it was easy to dismiss, but a few seconds later she felt it again.
Did anyone else feel that?
Neither of them heard her as they bickered. She sprang to her feet and brought her finger to her lips.
Shh! Listen!
Mid-argument, they silenced themselves, and held still. At their pale faces, she could tell they felt it too. The ground was shaking. It was getting stronger. Thump! 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 Their eyes all met, and they all instantly came to the same conclusion. That terrible fighting that was always off in the distance. It was here! And then, a loud roar, just east of their position. The great sound of it seemed to echo and echo in the air. All else fell silent. It was so close, and drawing nearer. Whatever was making that noise was the largest creature Medea had ever heard, other than the legendary dragon. Greater even than those huge ellipsors. Certainly faster. Like a pack of frightened pack rats, they huddled together, pressed against the largest boulder, trying to remain unnoticed. It was coming from exactly the direction they needed to go. There was no running past it. If the great ones were on their side, it would miss them and move on. Medea couldn't keep from shivering uncontrollably. They were still so far away from a town, and all of their supplies had dwindled dangerously low. What would they do if it found them? Wild seemed almost paralyzed or numb, pressed against the boulder but staring wide-eyed into absolutely nothing. And Chesney seemed to be gripping Cormu's sword with a death grip. The great thumping steps stopped beside the small gathering of boulders they used for shelter. It growled or grumbled, shaking the very air in their lungs. Stomp. Sniff, sniff. Growl. Stomp, stomp. Sniff. It was slowly circling the enclosure. They all tried to slowly rotate around the boulder to keep whatever was stalking them from seeing them at all, while staying perfectly silent. It gave out another great roar that was so loud they had to cover their ears, then began to slowly stomp away. The further away the stomp sounded, the more they slowly released the tension in their bodies, and could breathe once more. Finally, at least this went our way, she thought to herself, almost giddy in relief at having avoided whatever terrible danger the creature posed. They tiptoed back into the center of the clearing to gather their things and run. Wild Gath couldn't help but scream. There, at the west opening of the clearing, a horrendously large red beast watched them with bright yellow eyes. It saw them, and roared. And then, far away, another roar joined it. In a small, scared voice, all Midia could get out was a whisper.
"Oh, no."
There were two of them. The creature was 3 times Midia's height. It was some kind of giant lizard, with thick dark red scales the color of scabbed-over blood. The underside, a silvery gray. It stood on 2 thick legs, ending with wide 3-toed feet with talons as long as her forearm. Its back was long and carried itself mostly horizontally, on one end supporting a head with a jaw so wide it could bite her in half easily, and on the other a long tapering tail. The closest one roared again, fixing them with its hungry yellow eyes, and tried to step into the tight space to snap at them.
"What do we do?"
Wild screamed, clinging to Chesney.
I mean,
was all he could say. His eyes were darting back and forth around the clearing, panicking, focusing on nothing. As terrified as she was, Midia knew she had to make a decision. Any decision, or they were lost.
"We need to run."
Nobody moved, paralyzed as they were by their fear. At last she grabbed them both and pulled them.
"Run, now."
Which finally snapped them both out of their stupor. They ran for their lives to the east. Terrible, ground-shaking footsteps chased them. Through gasping breaths, Wild asked,
"Are we going to run all the way to that town? There's no way we can run that far." "We don't have a choice. If we don't run, we will die. Do you understand?"
The twin sets of footsteps were gaining. There was no more cover. It was all a flat plain. Already, Midia's legs and lungs were burning from the effort. Chesney grit his teeth.
"We'll never make it. Midia. Wild. Run. I'll slow them down."
He ground to a halt in the dirt, hurled his sword into a better grip, and faced both the monstrous things.
"Chesney, no. That's suicide,"
Midia cried, stopping herself and running towards him. Wild stopped as well, but was again stricken with insecurity about whether she should continue to run or come back.
"Midia, there's no time. Hurry, with the time I can buy for you two to escape,"
he yelled, a wild look in his eyes.
"I'm not leaving you behind. Ever."
She flicked her staff and revealed the hidden blade, gripping it like a spear.
"I'll fight beside you, like I promised."
There was no more time to argue. With primal screams, they both took the attention of one of the giant thundering lizards charging at them and engaged. The lizard's head came in high, trying to snap over her torso, but she jumped sideways and came in close to the thing's underbelly. It's gigantic, and fast. It's used to hunting down running prey and ending the fight with its jaws. As long as I stay behind its effective range, I have a chance. She thrust the sword staff up into the silvery gray scales of its underbelly, piercing a hole near the ridge of its chest. Hot red blood sprayed over her, but she concentrated and sent a bolt of lightning through her staff and into the beast. It roared in pain, and with amazing quickness, leaned to a side, kicked out with its leg, and knocked her through the air and away. She was lucky that only the blunt side of the taloned foot caught her, or she'd have been skewered. But even so, the blow was solid, and she screamed when she landed. It was a cracked rib for sure. The thing stalked forward towards her as she struggled to rise, blood dropping to the ground in great plops from the wound she had given it. It hardly seemed bothered. She fumbled for the staff, and brought it up in time to stab it into the monster's mouth as it came in for another bite. It reeled back, making a screech of pain. Medea fell to her knees, the violence of the blow making her rib explode in agony. She drew upon the power of the crown, concentrating on filling her body with the healing energy. Slowly, painfully, the rib ceased to ache, and some of the life returned to her limbs. Unexpectedly, the beast turned, and whipped its long tail into her. She had no time to dodge, and this time she was sent even further through the air. That same rib, plus 2 more, crunched sickeningly. When she landed, she briefly lost consciousness from the pain, though only for a few seconds. But it was enough. It loomed over her like a great black shadow, dripping saliva all over her body in anticipation of its meal.
"I'm so sorry, Dad,"
she whispered. The beast's right eye exploded. It staggered back, in pain. From the side, Wild was screaming, at the top of her lungs, shooting arrow after arrow at its head. Its attention momentarily diverted. She again concentrated on the crown. Once more, her ribs snapped painfully back into place. Her grip on her staff felt so weak, but she got to her feet as soon as she could stand. Wild had tried a few more arrows, but ended up having to run screaming almost as soon as she had gotten its attention. The great beast was giving chase, but less effectively than before, having to adjust due to its halved vision.
"Lead it over here, then get behind me,"
Medea yelled. Wild made no reply, but instead took off sideways, trying to lead it back around. In doing so, she got a bit too close, and almost took a blow from its tail, but it missed, and she was able to duck underneath in time and keep going in Medea's direction. Which meant Medea needed to decide. I could use freeze to stop it, but that has a good chance of failing. Or I could protect Wild while she showers it with arrows. Either is risky, but at least the latter gives us more time in case something goes wrong. She pressed a hand to her chest, and used the spell that would double her strength. Wild was almost to her.
"Wild, buff me, then shoot from behind me."
Wild shot a hand in her direction, and she felt the air around her thicken, then skidded to a stop just behind her, readying an arrow. The eyes were crazed with fear, but she was still holding on. Please, be enough. Seconds later, the great beast was upon her. To its surprise, she leapt up to meet its attack. She drove her sword staff completely through the top of its jaw. The sheer mass of the thing slammed her back to the ground, but she stayed standing, yanked out her blade, and twirled it around to give it a blow to the side of the head. Wild's aim could be better, and the scales turned even more away, but she was landing some hits. The onslaught confused the beast, which backed off for a moment. With a great roar, it charged once again. Medea swung her staff, cracking it against the upper teeth, and managing to break 2 of them off. It wasn't bothered by this at all, though, and she was kicked back through the air, landing on Wild and sending them both to the ground. Thankfully, the cushion of thickened air was enough to keep Medea from breaking any more bones, but the bruises were piling up. The lizard wasn't looking that great either. The blood from its chest wound hadn't closed, and its blood was scattered across the whole battlefield. 6 arrows were still embedded into its flesh. Wild gasped in a breath. The wind had been knocked out of her.
"You can use break, too, right?"
In Medea's nod, she continued.
"Do it with me. It's a trick my old man taught me."
Side by side, on their knees, they both pushed their hands out together and yelled,
"Break!"
2 twin waves of distortion erupted towards the monster. The rippling effect seemed to cascade and multiply at the spot both waves met. The monster either did not notice, or did not care. It dove at them, jaws wide, right through it. Like an overfilled balloon, the monster's mouth and throat expanded, then burst in a spray of gore and blood. The wave continued, exploding the rest of the creature from the inside, before erupting out of its back like a blood typhoon. The creature instantly collapsed into a heap, blood and meat pouring out of its throat in a viscous jelly. Wild was aghast at the sight.
"Oh, great ones,
She tried to say, but was stopped mid-sentence when overtaken by nausea, and threw up her meager lunch. Medea had already ran off, though, towards the other battle.
"Chetsney!" I am coming!"
she cried. Her mind was a jumble, caught between the fear he had died while she was unable to save him, the hope he was still hanging on, how her body would barely listen to her anymore, and trying to shove all of those feelings somewhere far away and stay numb, stay rational. To her instant elation, she saw that he was still standing. To her horror, she found him with his sword arm useless at his side, the sword of Cormu embedded deep into the beast's side. He was dodging away from biting attacks from the beast. It had so many slash wounds across its face and body that its silvery underside has turned bright crimson. The beast's tail had been cut off, leaving it unbalanced and losing incredible amounts of blood. He turned to see her. He was tired, bruised and broken, but relief showed on his face when he saw she was okay. He fell to his knee, exhaustion finally catching up to him. She saw a look in his eyes that she never, ever wanted to see again. The monster gave one last diving grab with its jaw, finally succeeding now that its prey could not dodge, and then adjusted its grip to hold him securely in its jaws.
"No!"
Medea screamed. She channeled every bit of life she had remaining into one final spell, and thrust her hand out. A blinding bolt of lightning shot through the air in an instant, zeroing in on the sword left embedded within the beast's flesh. The other side of the beast exploded away, and a shock wave of heated air blew Medea backwards. The beast had landed on the ground, still with Chesney in its grip. Medea staggered over, weakly trying to pry the jaws apart.
"Please. Please be alive, Chesney. Please," she sobbed.
A pale and filthy Wild joined her a moment later, and they managed to get him loose. He was unconscious, dozens of puncture wounds over arms and legs, losing blood. There was nothing left to give, but she gave it anyway. With her numb hands, she pressed against Chesney's heart and filled him with energy from the crown. Achingly slowly, the finger-sized holes began to close.
"Please, please, please, please,"
she whispered in a chant. Then, her energy gave out, and she too fell unconscious, over his half-mended body. When her awareness returned, the sky had turned from the heat of late afternoon to the cool of near sunset. The limited light from the overcast sky turned the landscape into a deep purple twilight beyond light and shadow, only shades. There was a blanket over her, and she was warm. There was a warm presence beside her. She looked to find Chesney there, breathing slowly. She tried to speak, but it only came out as a rasp. She swallowed, and cleared her throat, and tried to sit up, but it was like all her clothes were resisting her attempts to move.
"What happened?"
she managed. There was a sigh of relief nearby, and Wild appeared at her side, looking stricken.
"Oh, thanks, Sophie. You're okay. You passed out, and I was so scared I was going to lose you. I gave you 2 a pill each over an hour ago, and when you didn't wake up, I was completely at a loss. I just, let you sleep and hoped you'd wake up."
Wild bit her lip, wringing her hands. There seemed to be a lot of unspoken emotions in her eyes at that moment.
"Have you been watching over us this whole time?"
Wild nodded.
"I was slowly panicking, because swarms of those twin-headed bird things were circling around us. I hauled each of you away from the bodies of those monsters, and thankfully since then we've been left alone. Are you really okay?" "Well, let's see. Help me up,"
Medea said tentatively, reaching her hands out to Wild for help getting up. When she was standing, she realized the reason her clothing felt so restrictive was because it was caked with dried blood. Looking over at Chesney, he was even more covered. That fight had been brutal. The memory of that moment when she was certain she was about to be eaten was still fresh. She wasn't sure she would ever be able to forget it. And then, to see Chesney almost swallowed whole, she trembled in the remembering. Outside of the blankets, she felt empty and cold. Her broken bones and cuts had healed, but her bruises were raging. But she was whole.
"Yes, I'm okay. And, thank you, Wild, for saving me back there."
Wild's face turned pained. She whispered,
"Please don't thank me for that." "What do you mean?"
Wild's voice was small.
"When you two turned to fight, I panicked. I was frozen there like an idiot, unable to decide between running for my life and turning to fight. I was just, like, paralyzed. Useless. There you two were, fighting for your lives, for my life, and I was considering just running away and leaving you two behind. All I could think about was dying, where nobody even knew where I was, and never would.
She wrung her hands, twisting around her bow, looking anywhere but into Midia's eyes. There were a few things that annoyed Midia about Wild, but something like that she could never blame her for. Wild had just joined them on a complete accident, without even knowing what she was asking for. Wild continued, her voice beginning to shake.
I am so sorry, Midia. I understand if you hate me now. I already hate me. I almost got everyone killed. I'm supposed to be the responsible one. I'm older, but I was just a coward. I'm so sorry.
Midia stepped closer and hugged her.
Shh. Shh. It's okay. It's okay. Those feelings were completely natural. You didn't do anything wrong. Now you're forgetting how you did turn and fight, and saved my life, and took care of us all while we were dying.
Tears finally escaping, Wild blubbered into Midia.
I was so scared of being alone.
Midia let her vent her fear and disappointment in herself onto her. She didn't mind. Everyone had days where they needed someone. This day had been a long one. Being teleported to a strange land, being robbed, fighting disgusting creatures, and being in constant terror for their lives. But there had been nice things too. Eating that amazing lunch after weeks on the road. Meeting Wild. Flying through the sky. Her feelings on Wild were very mixed at times, in ways she wouldn't let herself think about, but seeing her like this made Wild seem all the more real as a person. A voice rasped from nearby.
You know, I thought the whole tearful apology bit was just you and me thing. Midia? How could you?
He even managed a wheezy chuckle.
Tedsney.
Both girls cried and descended to either side of him. They both squeezed him in a fierce hug.
Ow, ow, ow. Why couldn't I get the double hug when I wasn't covered in bruises?
Turns out he was fine as well and had just needed some rest before he could continue. Once he had been filled in on what happened, and thanked them both for saving his life, his face turned serious, which was slightly chilling since he was absolutely drenched in the blood of that lizard.
All right, we don't have any more options,
he began.
We need to run without stopping and get to that town. We're out of medicine, exhausted, and another serious fight will be deadly.
After that, there wasn't much discussion to be had. They needed to save their energy. Quickly, they discovered that a rope network was nearby. They decided to run under the towers connected by ropes, which almost assuredly would lead them to civilization. Sure enough, they could see the lights of fires and candle-lit windows beginning to twinkle on the horizon, next to a huge tower.
Almost there, everyone. Keep going on just a little longer,
he said, wordlessly, for they did not have the breath to spare. They followed. They reached the tall, pink-painted tower that seemed to be the loading point for the rope network they'd been following. They had no clue where it went, but at this point, it didn't matter. Right next to it was the edge of the city they had seen on the map. The town was small, probably no bigger than Ratsurt. The houses were all curiously egg-shaped, and the whole town was surrounded by a shabby, broken-down wooden fence. Everything seemed dusty and run down. Like things broke down here all the time, and only half of them ever got fixed. There was even a place where the town's name was supposed to be nailed up, but it had fallen off the 2 pegs. In faded, sand-worn letters, it read, Barsis. The people wandering around the open areas of the town were all Fioria. They looked similar to Lafri, though they didn't have long eyebrows, and from the bridges of their noses to the back of their head, they were covered in a shiny green chitinous plate, almost like they used huge beetles for wigs. One particularly shabbily dressed man was leaning against the half-fallen-down gate and saw them approaching. Out of breath, he didn't move towards them or help them at all.
Ooey, where the hell did you lot come from? Y'all from Nasquat?
Midia, the first to get her breath, replied, smiling as much as she could despite her complete exhaustion.
Yes, actually.
Behind her, Wild was still catching her breath and wheezing loudly, and Chesney was on his last legs. The man scowled and spit.
You best move along then. We don't take kindly to you people round here in Barsus.
Medea was aghast. They were clearly in need of help, hurt, and lost.
What? I said you best move on, girl. You deaf? They deaf up in Nasquat from all that disgusting, inbred Lubot nonsense up there, huh?
She was struck dumb by his response. She didn't even know where to start. Why was he being so rude? So awful? She had heard that the people of Sasquatch were different, but she never understood how much until that instant, how much of Nasquat culture she had taken for granted. Chesney grabbed her arm and dragged her into town.
Ignore him. Let's just get to an inn.
The Fiorla man didn't move, just spat into the dirt again and watched them go. All the buildings were very strange to them. Everything was shaped like eggs of different sizes, supported by posts in the ground to keep them from falling. They seemed all alike, like they were mass-produced, or at least made by the same person with the same design. A Fiorla woman and her son walked down the road. Not noticing them, Medea called out,
Excuse me, miss? Can you tell us where the inn is, please?
The woman turned her dull eyes over to them, then her face turned sour.
Off. That's what that smell was. I thought I stepped in some dung. I had heard that people from Nasquat stink, but to smell it in real life is something else. Ew!
She dragged her son away from them fast, turning up her nose. What in the world is wrong with these people?
I don't understand what's going on,
Medea said, almost to herself. A chill ran up her spine. Something was so terribly wrong here.
Why are they treating us so horribly? I have no idea, but I'm getting some really bad vibes here,
Wild said, clinging to Chesney and looking about the town. They were starting to get attention, and no one looked happy.
We need to find that inn, now,
Chesney declared, grabbing Medea's hand and leading her on. She was half-dazed at the complete disrespect and lack of empathy for some kids who were obviously in need of help. He made a beeline for the largest-looking building with a sign on it. The people they passed, men, women, even children, all saw them and immediately got out of their way like they had a plague. Whispers followed behind them. He pushed open the doors, leading them inside while he looked out at the town, before joining them. His face looked grim. Medea was at a loss. She was so used to being able to diffuse situations that she didn't know what to do. Chesney took charge, and she let him, feeling more and more lost at the outright scorn they were receiving. They sheepishly walked up to the old man at the desk who was leaning back and reading a paper. At their approach, his expression grew disgusted. Without them even having to speak, the old man practically shouted at them.
No, you're not staying here.
Chesney pulled out his money pouch.
Sir, please, we'll pay triple. No, quadruple. We just...
The innkeeper threw down his paper and stood up, gesturing at them angrily.
I said no. If you disgusting people from Nasquat stay here, all the beds will smell like you, and nobody from Sasquatch will be able to stand it. Now get out.
Almost on the verge of tears, Medea clasped her hands together and begged.
Sir, please. We need help. Enough. I said get out.
The man stepped out from around the counter and picked up a broom. They hurried outside before he could hit them. They stood outside the inn, darkness almost settling down, clueless as to what to do. If all of Sasquatch was like this, how in the world were they going to survive, let alone do what they needed to do here?
Do we just leave and use tents?
Wild whispered. Chesney crossed his arms.
That's a last resort. We're low on supplies, and completely at our limit. If anything happens out there, we could die.
Pensive, Medea added,
Maybe we should just fill up on medicine and some rations and then get out of here. We have to try, at least,
he said with a long drawn-out sigh. As they passed a building, she noticed a poster plastered to the side. In large, bold red letters, it read, "Traitors in our midst. Report suspicious activity." The poster had a grotesque depiction of a large, vicious-looking Lubot with exaggerated features, carrying away a Fiorla woman in torn clothes. A cruel-looking Doru man wearing a shirt with the word, "Nasquat sympathizer," was keeping them hidden behind a building while people searched in the street.
This is unbelievable. Chesney, did you see this?
He glanced over, then did a double take. Quietly he whispered,
I don't think Daphne was exaggerating. Or Strabo. We need to get out of here as soon as possible. Come on.
The whispering around town was getting louder. But there were no shops that would sell to them. One even threatened them with a sword. The townspeople were gathering, gawking, jeering at them. It didn't matter that they were just children. It didn't matter that they were tired and needed help.
These guys are pretty suspicious. What if they're Nasquat spies, huh? Hey, do a trick. Ha 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 ha. Worse than the Mycorats. This scum. Come any closer and I'll clobber you.
They slowly began backing out of the town as the people gathered around, hurling insults at them, and sometimes even rotten food. One particularly aggressive young man walked right up to Chesney's face and said, Is it true you Nasquat scum killed the diplomatic corps Lord Zagos sent to open peaceful diplomatic relations? What is wrong with you people? All he wanted was peace, and you spat in his face. When you insult the Emperor, you insult all of us. Get out. We don't want you here. All hail Lord Zagos, the second advent of Gabnid himself. Go back to those filthy Lubot and Nasquat lovers in the tent, you freaks. Take over Nasquat. Hail Lord Zagos. Take over Nasquat. Hail Lord Zagos. A throng of people was gathering, ushering in close around them from all sides. They had no choice but to back away towards the entrance of the town. More rotten food was thrown. All that was missing were torches and pitchforks. Wild was tugging at their sleeves. Chesney, we need to go, now. This mob is going to turn ugly in about 2 seconds. Everyone, run! They burst through the throng that surrounded them and ran out into the darkening twilight, with no destination other than away. When at last Chesney called for a halt, they turned to find that, thankfully, the villagers had not pursued them. What do we do now? Set up tents, and keep watch or something? Chesney could only throw up his hands. Give me a minute to think. Out in the dark, the night was awakening. Chirping, rustling, croaking noises surrounded them. In their present state, every new sound felt like some brand new horror stalking them from the shadows. Medea was beyond exhausted. She could barely remain standing. A part of her was seriously tempted to just lie down in the dirt. All she wanted to do was sleep. As they stood in silence, her mind kept playing back that moment, with the beast's jaws hovering over her, drool dripping onto her face, the stench of rotting meat. She shook her head. No, that's not helping. Think, Medea. There was one other thing that stuck in her mind from Barca, though. Go back to those filthy Lubot and Nasquat lovers in the tent. You freaks. What did he mean? What tent? Anywhere there were Lubot and Nasquat supporters, it was possible they could get help. In the near dark, she could see the flickering lights of Barca's, but off to the east, there was another large light. When they had come from the west, it must have blended in with the other lights of Barca's, but the view from south of town, it was clearly distinct, set apart. Hold on, look over there, she said, pointing to what she saw. They both turned to look. What is that? Chesney asked. His voice was so dry. I think that's our last chance at finding help tonight. Come on. Wild balked at the distant light.
Midia, I can barely move after today. It's probably just another group of murderous hicks. Let's just cut our losses and set up camp already.
Chesney was quiet for a time, sagging in the dark where he thought no one could see.
Are you sure?
Was all he said.
Please, trust me on this, Chesney.
He nodded.
Okay, let's go.
As tired as they were, the 15-minute walk to the light took closer to half an hour. Their backs ached under their packs. Their feet were blistered and torn. Morale was hanging by a thread. Crushing despair felt like it was stalking them, just out of sight in the shadows they left behind. One more disappointment, one more thing to go wrong, and it would crash upon them like an avalanche. As they approached, they could hear voices, talking, laughing, joviality, even a hint of music. Hope rose within her, but she refused to acknowledge it. It was far too dangerous to hope in a place like this. It was just as she had hoped, a massive tent. Thought hard to see in the dark, the tent was colored just as the fairs and carnivals that would visit Rotzirk every last quarter year, with huge gaudy stripes of pink and blue. They staggered into the open mouth of the tent, and she almost wept when she saw the people there were a mixture of Leifri and Lubot performers.
Please,
she begged, holding her hands together.
May we shelter here tonight? We'll pay anything. Just please, we need help.
The whole group turned to them in shock. A dead silence hung in the air. Then, a red-haired Leifri girl ran over.
Oh my goodness, these poor children look half dead.
A portly, kindly-looking Lubot with a smart-looking crimson suit dashed over as well.
By the great ones, what in the world happened? Oh, what am I saying at a time like this? Everyone, snap up. You two, go prepare some bed. Vega, bring over some bowls of soup. And Ellie, go get the first aid kit.
The next 2 hours was a blur. Once it became clear they were in immediate danger, all three of them dropped their packs and practically fainted. They were given hearty meals and warm blankets. Kindly performers gently tended their wounds. Their filthy, dirt and blood-stained clothes were taken away, and they were laid down to rest near a roaring fire. Before her head hit her pillow, she was asleep. Oh! When she at last awoke, it felt as though she had not shifted in her sleep at all. A moment of panic gripped her at the unfamiliar surroundings, and she bolted upright, but then calmed when it had all come back to her. It was barely morning anymore, if not already noon. Her companions were still sleeping. Her head ached terribly. Her mouth was dry. Her joints ached. She strongly suspected that yesterday's trials, along with all of them absolutely overdosing on minesatamol, were taking their toll. The drugs weren't cutting it anymore, and she could barely pick up the slack with her crown before she became so mentally and emotionally exhausted. A whole bottle, each. It was so unbelievably irresponsible, but what choice did they have at the time? They needed rest. Real, proper rest. Or the symptoms would get far, far worse. She needed to talk to Chesney about it. But looking over at him, she couldn't bear to wake him. His face was thinner than when she'd first met him. Some would have said that he'd lost his baby fat, or perhaps boyish air. But Chesney never had much boyishness in him when she'd met him. He had looked hollow, then, and she'd worked hard to fill that hollowness with compassion. And she would like to think she'd succeeded. He was reckless, sure, but so forgiving, and strong, and determined. Seeing him so drained and pale made her heart sink. She almost reached down to instinctively brush a hair away from his forehead, but noticed her hand was shaking.
So, Pen, what happens if you take too many? Over the short term, nausea, headaches, and weakness. Long term, it can lead to damage to the body's lymph structures and bone structure. But that would take years of abuse. Why do you ask? Have you already had some today?
To think, back then, she was appalled. Yesterday, she hardly batted an eye. This isn't sustainable. Her headache was getting worse. She quietly walked over to the small table that they'd eaten at the night before, and found a carafe of water. She almost drank it all on her own. She hoped there was more nearby.
"Oh, up are you?"
She turned to find the portly Lubot man in the snappy clothes that had given them shelter last night. He had spotted her through the entrance and walked over. She cleared her throat, but it barely improved the raspiness of her voice.
"Yes, and thank you. I can't begin to express how much you helped us. You all saved our lives."
He waved a hand as if to shoo her thanks away.
"Oh, tish-tosh, happy to do it. With things as they are, I hardly had much else to do. You and your companions are welcome here for as long as you need."
This man was so generous, she almost couldn't believe her fortune. It was exactly what they needed in this moment, and while a part of her was always suspicious of such good luck, at this moment she could be nothing but not infinitely grateful. They sat down together, quietly, and began to talk. She didn't have much of an appetite, but he insisted on giving her some bread and fruit to get her energy up. While she dined, he regaled her with the story of the circus troupe, and in turn, she passed on what bits of their journey she was comfortable sharing with strangers, as kindly as they were. The ringmaster's name was Ken, and he was also from Nasquat. It turned out this was part of a circus company that had formed a few years ago, something of a joint effort to improve relations between Nasquat and Sasquat. The performers had come from all over, of both continents, but at the moment were mostly Lafri from Nasquat and Lubot from Sasquat. There were apparently few opportunities for Lubot here in Sasquat, and they'd take work where they could get it, and that's why he had made the company, to bridge the gap between Nasquat and Sasquat, Lubot and the other races of Lennis. The racism of Sasquat had always been a bit of a problem, he explained, but in the last year or two things had suddenly taken a very dark turn. As it was now, the company was tolerated in Sasquat, barely, and all other outsiders were outright shunned. The treatment she and the others had received in Barsis was perhaps a bit extreme, even for Sasquat, but it was hardly uncommon. She could expect to get similarly cold treatment throughout the rest of the continent. As of now, the company was just staying put, waiting for things to blow over. Wild next joined them. She didn't look nearly as faded, which was to be expected since she hadn't been abusing minoketamol over the same time frame as she and Chesney had been, but in a way that made her immediate symptoms worse as she wasn't used to it. She was shivering, and so nauseous she couldn't only handle water and a single bite of fruit.
"Still glad you joined up?"
Medea asked, trying to make light of the moment, but she felt like an absolute fool the second the words left her lips. What a thing to say to a person who had almost died less than a day ago. Wild took a moment, considering how to respond. She settled on a weary smile.
"I'll have to have a new shirt made after all this is over. I flew on a dragon and almost got eaten by giant lizards, and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. Sounds perfect, right?"
Medea appreciated Wild crossing that gap. She played along.
What should I put on my shirt then? I don't know if I can fit it all on one side."
Chesney staggered over, shivering and wrapped in a blanket.
"Day off. Maybe 2.
He took the carafe, downed the whole thing, then went back to bed. Wild watched him go.
That boy's going to kill himself. Only 2 days. After a night like that? Well, 2 days is the most we've ever taken off. This is him being careful."
Oh. The day passed quietly. They felt improved enough for a proper meal by supper. After supper, some of the performers showed off their talents to their new captive audience, and the evening went by well. 2 of the Lafri girls were even singing duets, while doing acrobatics. That familiar twang of longing hit, seeing them sing and dance like that. She was left wondering what her life would have been like if she had been able to leave and pursue her dreams. Would she have been one of the performers here? She couldn't help but wonder what parts of the world she would have seen under much more pleasant circumstances. By the next day, they felt much improved. Medea could tell that Chesney was both itching to continue, but also apprehensive. She convinced him that it was okay to take the second day, even if they had improved. They truly needed the rest. After an hour, he was a bit stir-crazy. Midia was trying to read but kept being distracted by his restlessness.
Chesney, you're going to dig a trench by lunchtime with your pacing.
He stopped short.
I'm not pacing. Wait, am I?
She sighed.
You are, and it's driving me up the wall.
He sighed.
Sorry. I'm just never really sure what to do with myself when I have nothing to do. You can meditate on the spirits, go for a swim, exercise, practice your sword play, or you could even read one of my books.
He didn't seem particularly convinced about any of those. Then, an idea struck her.
Wait, why don't you go fishing? You said you missed it, didn't you? But I don't have a pole,
he said, though he did look intrigued. Ha! Got him, she thought. Midia put her book down, stood, and started shooing him out of the tent.
Oh, go ask Ken. I'm sure there's someone here who can lend you a pole and show you a good spot. Now out. Shoo! Shoo!
She knew how much he missed feeling normal. Hopefully, this would help. She knew how their old lives felt like lifetimes ago. They needed to hold on to what was important from time to time, or they would go crazy. She missed feeling normal too. She was into the next chapter and enjoying her peace, when Wilde draped herself over Midia's back over-dramatically, sighing,
I'm bored.
Why did I think I could read in peace today?
Wah, we almost died. Wah, I am bored. There's no pleasing you, it seems,
Midia said, grinning mischievously. Wilde flopped onto the floor nearby.
Shush you. Where's the big guy anyway? Well, fishing, I expect. Why? What?
She exclaimed, flipping over to her front to look at Midia properly.
He went fishing and didn't even ask me? I'm a Sanal for crying out loud.
In retrospect, bringing along someone of an aquatic race to go fishing seemed to be an obvious choice, though she was also secretly glad that he hadn't thought to ask her, either. The thought of the older girl going off alone with Chesney made her feel that strange, desperate feeling she had felt earlier at the rocks.
Sorry. I guess you probably just needed some time alone. I hate being alone. I get all anxious and feel like I'm being left behind and stuff.
It was then that an idea struck Midia.
Say, Wilde, why don't you and I do something together? Like what?
She said, before thinking and sitting upright in a hurry.
Ooh, want to braid each other's hair and gossip? Me and all my other girlfriends would get together and do that. It was so much fun.
Though a little shy and nervous about her idea, she was getting more and more excited while thinking about it.
No, even better.
She leaned in and whispered something in Wilde's ear, then said,
I think it will be a fun little surprise for when Chesney gets back.
Wilde seemed super energized by the suggestion.
Ah, that's a great idea. Let's grab those other two girls too, with the red hair. This is going to be perfect.
Hey! Hours later, Chesney returned, laughing along with one of the Lubot from the troop. Midia hadn't quite noticed the other man before, but she was glad Chesney had found somehow to go along and join him. Chesney looked relaxed, more than a little tanned, and supported half a dozen large fish tied to a long staff he balanced on his shoulders.
Hey, Midia!
He greeted her when he came inside the tent.
Thanks for suggesting the little fishing trip. This guy called Fast Joe came along, and he's practically better at fishing than I am.
The Lubot man bowed before her, took her hand and kissed it gently.
A pleasure to meet you, miss.
He was tall, with short blonde hair parted in the middle. She had no idea what races he was a mix of, but his ears were large, purple, and were almost like membranous wings at the side of his head. He had on a perpetual gentlemanly smile, and his most distinguishing feature was a perfectly cared-for thin mustache that curled smartly on both ends. She was taken by surprise at the gesture. She didn't think anyone had ever greeted her that way before.
My, such manners. If only my oaf of a traveling companion could pick up a few.
She said, raising an eye at Chesney and smiling good-naturedly.
Hey, what do you mean? I have manners.
She sighed.
Chesney, your idea of the height of manners is not eating with your hands.
He stammered for a moment.
But that is good manners, right?
He looked genuinely confused. She patted him on the head.
Haha, it's okay. I'm just teasing. Come on, let's go and share your catch with everyone and help get dinner ready.
Today, the tent felt alive with energy. Or maybe it was just her. But it seemed like everyone had a fire lit up inside them as they talked and prepped and cooked. By the time they were done, there was a veritable feast laid out for the dozen or so attendees. There were Boston and bream fillets drenched in butter and citrus juice, twin-beak pot pies, and salted and soft-boiled root vegetables in a creamy red sauce. There was even wine, and they let Chesney and Medea have a small glass as well. Wilde had drank too by the end of the meal, and her beaming face was flushed and her laughter came easy. Being here, in this tent, felt almost like home. She was able to completely forget about the dangers that surrounded them. For tonight, she could let down her hair and forget about the anxiety of tomorrow. After supper, they cleaned up and set up a fire to stay warm by it and relax. Medea was getting quite nervous. Wilde and the other two girls caught her eye and gave her big smiles and approving gestures. Her stomach was full of fluttering things all of a sudden. Well, here goes nothing. Hesitatingly, Medea stood up and faced the ensemble.
I just wanted to say, thank you so much for the amazing hospitality you've shown us. It's no exaggeration that without your help, we might not even be here right now. And so, as a thank you, we wanted to show our appreciation.
She waved at Wilde hastily to come up and join her. She could feel her face was flaming hot with embarrassment.
I've been told that this troupe had performed Tales of the Immortals before, and so I've decided, with some help, to sing one of my favorite songs from the musical.
Wilde and the other two Laffery girls, Carice and Himoan, joined her side, looking very excited. Chesney caught her eye for just a moment. He seemed very surprised. Her face flushed a little harder. This was somehow more embarrassing, knowing Chesney was going to see it. Sure, he'd caught her singing from time to time, but this was different now that she was actually wanting to try a real performance.
We'll be performing Duty and Love, the song in the middle where Sophie is conflicted between her doubts about herself, obligations to the people of Lennis, and her own unsaid feelings towards Cormu.
Medea tried to keep her breathing even. She couldn't be out of breath for the performance.
One last thing. Since we don't have all the instruments set up, I'm going to need a little help from the audience.
She explained that the background was going to be a cappella. She assigned each audience member into groups. Each group had a set of subtle sounds they'd make together, approximating drums, or strings, which Medea would direct. Once everything was established, the room quieted. With her hands, Medea gestured to begin the song with a slow beat. She couldn't look directly at anyone. Her confidence would crumble, and so she focused on the group as a whole, looked at the spaces between faces, inhaled, and shakily began to sign the first words. She was playing the part of Sophie in the song. Wilde, Carice, and Himoan were playing the parts of the chorus, the three different conflicting parts of Sophie's mind trying to pull her in every direction, and make her finally admit to the feelings she had inside her for Cormu. They would go back and forth, with Sophie singing her worries, and the chorus replying in the true thoughts under the surface. Sophie would deny, and like that the song would continue. All four of the parts had moments where they could shine individually and properly establish the complicated whirlpool of emotions of Sophie. And all through the song, more instruments were added, and the choreography of the movements grew even more dramatic as Sophie was reaching her breaking point. Finally, just before the climax, Almost all the instruments except for a heartbeat-like rhythm were silent, and each of the parts of her mind sat down and explained how Sophie needed to put down all the worries and duties and obligations and expectations, and just admit her true feelings. Then, everything came crashing back in, and she would finally sing with her true heart, supported by harmony from the chorus in a wildly triumphant and freeing finale. If she was being honest, this was always her favorite part of the Tales of the Immortals. As a young girl, she would dance for hours in the woods or in empty barns, singing this piece. She always felt so connected to it. The conflict between obligations and true desires, falling in love, finding your truth, our destiny. Every part of it seemed to scream out to her. Now, singing it in front of an audience, the feeling was mesmerizing and so hard to describe. Her first few notes had been so shaky, but when she focused on the lyrics, and the feelings buried in them, she had never felt more connected. She quickly got her confidence in wearing the mask of Sophie over her own being, and let herself be drowned in the role. All her life, she had always felt so connected to Sophie, only ever prayed to her, always wondering what she had been like. Now, singing this song, wearing her crown, she really felt like she could understand her better. Coming to a foreign world, pulled in so many directions by her compassion for everyone suffering, and feeling like her feelings for Cormu were selfish in the face of so much pain and need. The words came so natural tonight, she didn't even need to think half a bar ahead, and instead could focus on the complicated movements and choreography that went in them that were so key in helping to portray the emotions of the piece. Even directing the crowd to be the music seemed to come effortlessly, and like they too were trapped in the same spell, they played their part beautifully. The room was electric. She was no longer pushing out the song, but being pulled by strings, flowing seamlessly from moment to moment. Then, at that moment when the climax came crashing in, and she truly sang with her full strength and ability, it happened. She had tried so hard to keep her eyes unfocused, to look between the faces, but just then, her eyes found and rested upon Chesney's face. And after that, she couldn't look away, and it was like she was only signing for him. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, but she couldn't stop. Her performance continued unwavering, but it was like everything else was slowly losing focus, and all that was left was her and him. She at once felt like a fool, and like a shooting star, a silly child, and a queen. Her chest felt tight, and squirming, and cold, and hot, and crazy. It felt unreal, and too real. At last, when the performance was over, all was silent. Chit bit her lip anxiously, and bowed before them, joined shortly after by her chorus. And then, the spell was broken. Raucous applause filled the tent to bursting. Her face grew hot and she couldn't help but grin like a silly, foolish girl, but she was so happy to have done it, to finally try. Everyone stood and cheered and clapped and celebrated. She felt so giddy, and full of life, and thankful all at once. At the end of the line of congratulations was Chesney. Though the noise did not diminish at all, everything else became quiet and indistinct. Her eyes darted over every feature of his face to try to understand what he thought of it, clutching her hands to her chest nervously.
Well, what did you think, Chesney?
His mouth hung open a bit, while he struggled to find what to say. He stammered out half a dozen half-made words. At last he swallowed and shook his head as if to focus.
Incredible. Nydia, that was amazing. I don't even know what to say.
Wilde clamped a hand on both their shoulders and leaned in with a grin, winking at her.
Ah, I think he liked it. And damn, girl, you have a set of pipes on you.
At that, both of them looked away, suddenly faces growing even hotter. At their sudden shift, Wilde seemed to find something very funny and she laughed uproariously.
Oh, you two kids are so cute. Come on, let's go. Fastro's going to show us his sword juggling act.
At that, the awkward moment was over, and she dragged them both from place to place, mostly doing the talking. The evening felt open, and silly, and fun from then on, and they spent the last night of their vacation staying up late into the night, reveling in the warmth they each brought to the occasion. When finally they did begin to make ready for bed, Medea was still far too excited for sleep, though she knew she needed the energy for tomorrow. That strange, awkward feeling had gone away for the most part, and she was finally able to talk to Chesney without a million little thoughts distracting her.
So, do we have a plan for tomorrow?
She asked, whispering in the warm dark of the quiet tent. Chesney scooted inside his travel bedding and turned to her.
Yep, don't worry. I've been busy thinking, but I'll tell you and Wild in the morning.
She rolled up into her bedroll as well.
Ooh, Chesney, party leader and man of mystery.
He laughed quietly.
Hardly. I think I'm pretty easy to figure out.
There were 1,000 little things she suddenly wanted to say to that, but nothing came from her mouth. He continued.
Oh, and, I just wanted to say, you were really beautiful up there. Wait, I mean amazing. Amazing.
He smacked his forehead.
Sorry, I'll just shut up and stop making an ass of myself now. Good night, Medea.
She chuckled, her stomach twisting into knots.
It's okay. You have a good night too, Chesney.
Sleep did not come easy to her that night. Her heart was racing still from the performance. Over and over she played the evening's events in her mind, almost wanting to leap up and twirl in happiness at finally trying something she was both terrified of and longed for so long. It had felt so scary, but so right as well. Would the next time be the same? Or easier? Could there really be a next time? Did she want there to be a next time? But running under it all was another stream of thought that was just as persistent. Over and over, she replayed catching Chesney's eyes in the crowd, and the way her heart at once exploded and ached. Of course, she cared for him. She always had since they first met, and she felt that instant connection. Even he felt it. And they had fought for each other, protected each other all this time, saved each other's lives over and over. Of course she cared for him. Who couldn't after all they'd been through? She would always be there for him, and he would always be there for her. She trusted in him, just as she trusted the sun would rise again. So why was she feeling this way now? Why was she snapping at Wild? Why did she balk whenever Wild would be near him, or touch him, when she'd done nothing but be their friend? And why, now, did her tongue turn to knots behind her lips when he would speak to her? Feel like singing in one moment, and nauseous the next? Dashing from moment to moment from elation to despair. It was too much, far too much. She didn't want this. Whatever this was, it ached inside her. Would she feel like this tomorrow? And forever? Would it get worse? How could she continue? How could she fight, when her mind would do nothing but spin in circles? Quietly, in the dark, she clasped her hands together and whispered a prayer.
Sophie, please. I don't know what to do.
There was no answer. Afterward. Please drop by the archive and comment to let the creator know if you enjoyed their work.